Hello, welcome everyone to this installment of the Berkeley Conversations. My name's Tony Cascardi, and I'm the Dean of Arts and Humanities at Berkeley. Today, I'm joined by three of my distinguished colleagues who are going to help us think about the role of literature and the arts in times of crisis. I want to welcome Mark Danner, Darcy Grimaldo Grigsby, and Nick Matthew. Mark Danner is professor of English and journalism, who for 3 decades has written on politics and foreign affairs, focusing on war and conflict. He's covered wars and political conflict in Central America, Haiti, the Balkans, Iraq, and the Middle East, and the story of torture during the so-called War on Terror. A longtime staff writer at The New Yorker, he's now a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. His work has received a National Magazine Award, 3 Overseas Press Awards, an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and an Emmy. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Century Association, the World Affairs Council, and serves as a resident curator at the Telluride Film Festival. In 1999, Danner was named a MacArthur Fellow. Darcy Grimaldo Grigsby is professor of the history of art and holds the Richard and Roy Goldman Distinguished Professorship in the Humanities. She specializes in 18th through early 20th century French and American art, visual and material culture, particularly in relation to the politics of race and colonialism. Her writing embraces painting, sculpture, photography, and engineering, as well as the relationships among various media forms and new technologies from the 18th to the early 20th centuries. Among her books are Extremities, Painting Empire in Post-Revolutionary France, and Colossal, Engineering the Suez Canal, Statue of Liberty, Eiffel Tower, and Panama Canal. She's the recipient of the Clark Prize for Excellence in Art Writing, 2 Andrew Mellon New Directions Fellowships, a grant from the Graham Foundation, and perhaps most important of all, the Distinguished Teaching Award at UC Berkeley. Nicholas Matthew is Associate Professor of Music, whose published work has focused principally on music and politics in the 18th and 19th centuries. A specialist on Beethoven, he writes about the place of music in political institutions, the role of music in public life, and the ways in which music produces social attachments and collective identities. His acclaimed book, Political Beethoven, looks at the politically charged rhetoric of Beethoven's music and its later reception, and explains the relationship between that music and the popular culture and politics of the Napoleonic era. His current work focuses on music, materialism, and markets in the long 18th century. So welcome all of you. Thanks for taking the time to be with us to share your thoughts and your work. We know that these are times in which some of our most common and familiar phrases, ones we sometimes just took for granted, all of a sudden have a very real and deep meaning. Phrases like, how are you? So let me begin by asking each of you how you're doing, how your teaching and your work has been impacted by this crisis. Maybe we'll just go around the proverbial table in alphabetical order. Mark, how are you?
Well, I'm very well. Thank you, Tony. I'm delighted to be here in this very distinguished group. I mean, it's a very bizarre time in which our private lives and our public lives have been, which are traditionally divided in a liberal system, have been crunched together. So I'm finding suddenly classes taught from home have children running through them, and you no longer have the divisions that you count on that structure your life. And on the one hand, that's very difficult. Challenging is the new word. But on the other hand, it's rather fascinating. It gets you to think about things in a new way. And the stress, I'm trying to make use of the stress in some productive fashion to think about the preconceptions I had before the virus.
Well, we're all learning to make use of things we knew very little about before this. Darcy, how are you?
Well, I'm fine. Let's just say that. It's all very traumatic, I think, and I'll address that a bit when I talk with all of you. We have a graduate student strike going on, and with very little visibility, but it does mean that I'm teaching the sections as well as the lectures for my course. And I'm pretty relieved I get to do that because I can't seem to get the PowerPoint and the big group together at the same time without it freezing. But I just do sections now as conversations, and I get to see everybody because it was such a brutal, sudden rupture from the real relationship you have in the classroom. I've never been an advocate of online teaching. I've resisted it, and really, give lectures that are interactive with the students, etc. So now I'm recording lectures, and they are of a different sort, far more ruminative, but also without that sense of how well they're following it.
Well, we certainly are learning to appreciate many of the things that we took just in the course of a day before we are thrust into this crisis. Nick, how are you?
I'm doing fine, and my family's doing fine. I think, as Mark and Darcy just implied, we're the lucky ones. None of us are out looking for work or being forced to do work in dangerous circumstances, or at least very few of us. But it just occurs to me that just how much bound up this crisis is with a particular form of new media, probably as much as any crisis before it. And that for us, I think the main thing, apart from this rearrangement and new sort of proximity to our families, and of course going low-level bonkers, as well as finding all kinds of special moments in there too, is a whole new form of tutelage and learning with respect to particular kind of media interfaces, and a whole new form of sociality, of which this is an example.
Absolutely, we are actually we're living part of this new reality in this Berkeley Conversations today. I'm certainly not the only one to have noticed that people around me, people I talk with, Zoom with, have been rereading works that they had read long ago. They've been listening to music again, rehearing things, finding new things, looking at artworks in new and different ways. And our turn to literature and the arts is so important because this health crisis, what appears to be a health crisis, is in fact a social crisis, is in fact a very human crisis, and the kind of crisis that really makes us think and reflect on what really matters to us. I know people scrounging around for copies of Camus' The Plague, of Susan Sontag's Illness as a Metaphor, Orhan Pamuk, the Nobel Prize winning writer, who had been in the middle of writing a novel about a plague, in fact, recently published a very interesting piece in the New York Times about the whole history of plague-situated novels. But there's an awful lot more to be said about the role of literature and the arts in times of crisis than just talking about books about plagues and existential quandaries. And that's where I hope you will take us. Mark, let's start with you. You inhabit essentially two worlds, or what I think of as two worlds. As a journalist, you write about current affairs, you write about events. In the past, you've written about some great traumatic crises, Sarajevo and Baghdad in particular. But you're also a professor of literature, and you teach a wide range of works of prose fiction. Maybe you could just start off by telling us how you navigate between these two worlds and how you're navigating between those worlds now.
Thank you, Tony. Yes, they don't feel like two worlds at all to me, I should say. On the one hand, this crisis makes me think of a general typology of crises. There are revolutions, there are coups d'etats, there are pandemics, there are wars. All of these things have in common this kind of disrupting of daily reality. I published a book a few years ago called Stripping Bare the Body. And that was based on a quote by a Haitian politician. Haiti is a place I've written about a lot, the political violence in Haiti. And the quote was, political violence strips the body bare, the better to place the stethoscope and hear what's going on beneath the skin. And the general notion there is that crisis reveals to us fundamentals of our society, inequalities, class conflicts, various conflicts between the public and the private. And it seems to me that this crisis does a lot of that. I mean, on a pretty mundane level, we see, as Nick referred to, we are, as upper middle class professionals, relatively safe, although we're going crazy slightly in our homes. Working class are either out of work or they're on the front lines in some way, risking their lives. On the other hand, we've had revealed to us the certain level of government corruption and incompetence has been stripped bare, the way the state has been defunded for many years. A number of things are kind of coming home to us, I think, in a dramatic way. It seems to me, of the crises that you mentioned, Tony, the one this most resembles probably is a siege. I did, as you said, cover the siege of Sarajevo. And I remember indeed this feeling of going crazy, being stuck in the house and having to deal with that rising craziness, particularly the kind of craziness that comes with kids, not only going bonkers and going off the walls as my own children have, but the sadness of seeing children who can't play outside, the melancholy of that. And this reminds me of Sarajevo in that sense. The first time I was in Sarajevo, there was the sledding massacre, which is a dozen or so kids snuck out of their apartment houses and went sledding on a little hill in Sarajevo. And the Serbs snipers spotted them and shelled them and killed 7 of them. So this kind of conflict between inside and outside that you see in a siege is very much, it seems to me, part of our daily lives. Also, to come back to your question about literature, if you look at A Journal of the Plague Year by Defoe, which has long been one of my favorite books, which isn't really a journal, it's a novel based on the plague in London in 1665. It was written in 1722. One of the significant details is the rich fled town. The rich left. And this is exactly what has happened, for example, in New York City, that you've got these conflicts in the countryside where people from New York are going to their second homes. And the Defoe book, you read it, it's got many, many similarities to the current situation. People rising up and demanding an end to the quarantine, strange concoctions which are supposed to cure the plague, which of course, as we know, our president has been promoting on national TV. In London in 1665, it was sort of mountebanks on the street offering these strange concoctions and pieces of silver and other things that were supposed to guard you from the plague. In our own time, it's Donald Trump telling you to inject disinfectant. So it seems to me that that piece of literature, Defoe, has been very valuable. Another that I've been reading in my class on postmodernism is White Noise by Don DeLillo, which famously has at its center the airborne toxic event, the airborne toxic event. And like so much of DeLillo's fiction, it seems almost creepily prophetic. I mean, it makes you think, as I often do with Dostoevsky, that if you're smart enough and you look hardest at the present, if you have enough of a mind, you can see the future. And DeLillo does this amazing deconstruction of the class structure. These things happen to poor people who live in exposed areas, he said. Society is set up in such a way that it's the poor and the uneducated who suffer the main impact of natural and man-made disasters. I'm a college professor. Did you ever see a college professor rowing a boat down his own street in one of those TV floods? And it's full of humor about class differences in times of crisis. The final writer who it seems to me comes home very strongly at the present time is Milan Kundera. I've been thinking a lot of his unbearable lightness of being. And the reason is because I think one of the things the pandemic has done is scramble our public and private worlds. Uh, on the one hand, our private worlds and public worlds have been forced together in the home in a way they haven't been. I have to worry at any moment my children will come running into this conversation screaming like banshees. But on the other hand, it's reminded us how an incompetent government can get us killed, that it isn't possible to simply ignore politics and avoid it. You know, I think it was Trotsky who said, "You may not care about politics, but politics cares about you." And he said it in talking about war, actually. But it seems to me that we are certainly reminded of that, in fact, you can get killed by an incompetent government. And we have this in The Unbearable Lightness of Being. The protagonist is a surgeon who thinks he is able to avoid the decrepitude and the horribleness of the government in Cold War Czechoslovakia. But eventually he can't. He has to resign and become a window washer, a very symbolic profession. So he becomes a window washer because, in fact, as a surgeon, he can't but be involved with the corruption of public life. And I think we're kind of seeing this in the current pandemic, that we can think we can get away from Trump and the current administration, but we can't. It comes for us in a sense. There's nowhere to escape. And also, I should say, to put it on a slightly brighter and more optimistic line, it makes us also be grateful for our public officials in California who have done the opposite of what the federal government has done, which is behave responsibly and competently.
Well, it certainly is a crisis that helps us recognize who the grown-ups are. And I think your references to Dostoevsky, Defoe, Kundera are absolutely right on. In fact, that Defoe novel, The Journal of the Plague, is one that Pamuk talks about quite a bit in his piece in the New York Times. But Mark, I want to take you back to something you were saying just a couple of minutes ago when you were referencing the way in which political violence and war have this effect of stripping the body bare. Are you saying that all these crises have a common denominator and that's it? Because there's been an awful lot of focus on the exceptional nature of this particular crisis and this pandemic.
I think that's a great question. And I think they have a common denominator in this kind of plasticity of life that is shown under a crisis. You know, Wordsworth said of the French Revolution, bliss was it then to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. Why was that? The reason was that suddenly everything seemed possible. The normal structures of our life, which we take to be determined and necessities, suddenly fall away. And you find that, and this overlaps very much with the artistic project, that you find you can live life artistically. You can create different ways to live. You can create yourself. Your life is not, to use an engineering term, path dependent in the way that you thought it was. And I think there is a similarity in the present moment when it comes to the pandemic, that we see that there are, in fact, different ways to live. We understand that communality is a necessity. I mean, I feel the melancholy of teaching a class online, and I realize that human contact is something that's viscerally necessary to us in a way that I perhaps hadn't before. And I think we can hope that this kind of plasticity, this kind of ability to reshape life, will be something that is taken away from this crisis, which is to say that we retain after the crisis is over. I think that's the optimistic way to look at it, that we'll see new ways of relating to one another that won't be determined by the crisis, but will be a result of the creativity that we can see that's possible in our ways of living.
Well, you know, it's often said, Mark, that necessity is the mother of invention, and I think we're witnessing crisis as being the mother of creativity. And I think of so many writers and artists whose works were born out of crisis situations. Two of particular interest to me in my own work, Cervantes,
Oh, yeah.
who says in the preface to Don Quixote that it was literally born in a jail. He was in jail when he first got the idea of writing Don Quixote. And to the 18th century Goya, whose work was produced, much of it in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, and whose disasters of war are very much like the political the depictions of the political violence you have been writing about and speaking about.
It's so true. We wouldn't, without the Battle of Lepanto, we would not have Don Quixote.
That is for sure. I wonder if I could, since you are so versatile in what you do and you have such broad interests, are there particular works of visual art that speak to you as a writer in this crisis?
Gosh, that's a great question. I think Jericho and his raft speak to me very resoundingly, and what Julian Barnes wrote about it in his, I forget the name of his novel, but his wonderful treatment of that painting speaks to me very broadly. Cinco de Mayo, the Goya painting, and in general the disaster.
The shootings of the 5th of May, 1808.
Exactly. Speak to me very strongly in this pandemic, absolutely. I would pick those. I think I would pick those two. I mean, the third, which is Picasso, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, Guernica. I couldn't think of it for a moment. Which is the great depiction of time out of not only horror of war, but time out of joint, out of something happening, the unexpected and its ability to shift and destroy time and space. It was long been a favorite painting of mine.
And indeed, with the phrase "time out of joint," one has, of course, Shakespeare in mind, and remembers that a lot of his work was produced during plague years. But your reference to the visual arts, I think, is a perfect segue to Darcy. Darcy, as an art historian, you are especially alert to what it means to look closely at things, what it means to relate to things and people by looking closely. Painting is, of course, something that invites and rewards very close looking. What are your thoughts about that kind of activity, that closeness of looking and seeing in this moment of crisis? And what would you say that art shows us about closeness and connection? And what does this crisis show us about connection and proximity and closeness and distance?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Well, I have a bit of a PowerPoint here, and I'm interested in how Napoleon is coming into all three of our works. I wrote my first book on the Napoleonic Empire and the Restoration, and have a chapter on the raft I invite you to read. But let me begin. I'm going to begin with reading a little bit because I feel I may not be as eloquent as I would like. We're looking at a close-up of van der Weyden's deposition. And as I say, one of the things that's been striking me so brutally in some ways is the discrepancy between all our experiences in general. The kind of dissonance between our California springtime and the suffering we know may be happening at some distance from us. So I've been thinking about dissonance, and I've been thinking about the discrepancy again between each of our experiences and the experiences of others, and of course with economic inequity, racial hierarchies, injustice, bad leadership, and so forth. I worry about my students who are not being irritated by children, but some of them are isolated in their own apartments and haven't had face-to-face contact of much sort since. But I've also been interested in the dissonance between our internal life and the outside more generally. And I don't mean just the place outside us or the globe we no longer crisscross on airplanes, or the besieged hospitals, prisons, refugee camps, homeless camps, but all the distance between ourselves and, of course, in everybody else behind a mask and 6 feet away, or on a digital Zoom program such as this. But I'm also thinking more fundamentally about the distance between our interior experience and even the mundane things outside ourselves. Some mundane things taken in hand, like our coffee cup, and some never held or touched, like the tree across the street or someone else's door. What exists out there? We know it's out there because we can see it, but we're not touching it. Painting, the medium that I've written on many, many different media, and I'm fascinated about the relation between them, but painting is the medium which has always most compelled me. And it's predicated on distance, painting. It is always outside us, and it is not something we touch. Painting's precondition is its substitution of sight for touch. Painting is social distancing of a sort. And its challenge to us as viewers is to connect through sight, to experience connection optically, remotely, even through Zoom, that remoteness. But painting has always been about that. Great painting, and I'm going to show you what some of my favorites, and my examples are European, mostly French. Great painting has made seeing and remoteness part of its very reason for being, right? The stunning illusion of our proximity to the never to be held up close. And not surprisingly, painting again and again has ruminated on the sense of touch that it had to compensate for. The tactile, the haptic, the bodily, the intimacy of holding, caressing, that which is outside ourselves, that which is cold or warm, soft or hard, smooth or rough, inert or alive. Painting has had to take as its very premise its removal from our actual physical contact with what it shows. And paintings such as this also describe an overwhelming grief that sometimes entails a choice to shut down vision, to shut it off. Because in grief, sometimes we cannot bear the cruel awareness. Let me back up here. Because as we experience grief and inside, we sometimes cannot bear the unawareness of the world outside of us to that grief, right? We cannot bear even the cruelty of beauty when we are absorbed within ourselves in grief. And van der Weyden's remarkable picture here offers both the sense that sorrow entails shutting one's eyes, but also the sheer beauty of looking upon the painting. And he makes it, and as does Jacques-Louis David here with the picture of someone covering their head in sorrow. But let me point out that van der Weyden's painting is particularly perhaps cruel. We see the Virgin here with her eyes closed, like the figure who's covering her eyes with white cloth. And yet look at this non-touch of the mother with her son. That is a kind of parallelism. It's lacking contact, but it's a sympathetic repetition. And yet I would call the painting cruel too, because it's so bloody gorgeous, because it's velvet and it's fur and it's brocade, it's illusionism, is the sense that all of that persists even in our sorrow. I know that grief is sometimes about a refusal of sight, and painting is often knows where sight cannot go. But I think it's pretty remarkable what it invites us to imagine as a kind of connection across distance. And of course, it's not at all surprising that painting would take on the very fact of touch, what it cannot offer us as a visual object, as one of its most powerful themes. And this is a detail of a small painting by Edward Vuillard called Intimacy. And it's not his regular house with his women, mother and sister, and heavy wallpaper. It's a much more spare setting. It's when he was visiting someone. And that's a Polish sculptor asleep. And I just adore this hand that reaches out. I want to be under my covers. And yet I want my hand to reach out and touch the world. The deprivation of touch is one of the exceedingly painful parts of our experience. Painting, as I say again and again, is about thematizing what hands feel, but also the ways opticality does not provide us with that sensation, right? With that hard coolness of that jug. It is, in Vermeer's hands, always a matter of the sheer, tender evasiveness of the optical effect of what we can see, but that which might disappear, what it is to rely on seeing only and not touching. And I bring now us to Napoleon, and we're looking at a detail of Antoine Jean Gros, Bonaparte visiting the plague-stricken of Jaffa. We're looking at a painting in which, again, touch is being thematized, but here it's not just being thematized, it's about what it is to touch the plague, what it is to touch the ill, what it is to touch what was called the bubo of bubonic plague. And the painting is a great master piece of propaganda on behalf of Bonaparte that shows him doing the taboo. The doctor behind him is trying to stop him from touching that illness, trying to tell people, for God's sakes, put on your mask. But instead, Bonaparte says, oh no, it's all a matter of moral courage. And what you're dying of is your fear, right? And that sense that a leader can lead us so wrong, right? And offer us this counter narrative in which his leadership pivots purportedly on his willingness to touch when the Dr. Desgenette in the background tries to hold him back. Such a startling picture, all the more so when you find out that he in fact had indeed, as rumors circulated, had poisoned his troops, that he didn't have enough transport to get them out of Jaffa, out of Syria. And yet he makes this propaganda machine that is about saying, I was a courageous leader here. And it is, of course, an entirely a falsehood. And here is a detail of the Raft of the Medusa. I wrote about both these paintings 20 years ago. And paintings that to me offered such extraordinary models of different ways of understanding sight and touch and contact and collectivity. Géricault's Raft of the Medusa remains one of my touchstone artworks. Because while The Plague Stricken of Jaffa is about the leader who pretends to a moral courage and indeed enacts a falsehood and risks the lives of all of his soldiers, Jericho's Raft of the Medusa is about collective suffering. And it's about all those, and they were hierarchically classed on that raft, all those who died in order, partly in their suffering, to lift up the most disenfranchised figure of the Black man. And it is a collective suffering that we, because the painting looks into the distance, we repeat from our external position. We look the same way that pyramidal mound of people look. We join them. And that man at the apex is part of Jericho's, of course, capital L, liberal political opposition to the Bourbon monarchy and to the sheer corruption. Talk about politics finding us, the sheer corruption of the Restoration government that put these people in this situation. And yet what I also note about this extraordinary painting is that all of those entangled bodies that are all about touch and proximity, all of them are about lifting a man up who has to wave to that teeny, teeny ship at the horizon in order to save those who are still alive on the raft. It moves from touch as constitutive of collectivity to a sense that sometimes survival has to be across space. It has to be through vision and that distancing. The only way that ship will find them is if the man and the people on the ship encounter one another optically. So I think it still points to painting's power, both to offer us the illusion of proximity to that which we can never hold, but also the necessity of allowing oneself to be intimate with that which is far away. That's my deal.
Darcy, the Raft of the Medusa, the Jericho image is nothing if not extreme, and you've written a book entitled Extremities. I'd be curious to know your reaction to the many images that we've seen in recent weeks of empty cities, of Times Square vacant of people, of Los Angeles, of Seoul, of so many places around the world, places in Italy that are absolutely empty and vacant, that speaks so much to the solitude and the remoteness that conceal the very dense interior lives that are happening around those empty spaces. What's been your reaction to those images?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. That's a really interesting question. Well, first of all, we've all seen the ways people have tried to create some kind of contact, even as they have been quarantined in apartment houses, whether it be the early images of Italians playing music and the amazing moment when they put their glasses of Prosecco on long bamboo sticks to meet one another across the space between them. I think they're frightening images, the images of empty cities. I think those who look upon the empty city have a far greater challenge to maintaining some sense of connection than those of us who go out into our garden and see a bird alight on a tree. I find them very frightening, and none of these paintings are clearly about that vacancy. There certainly are paintings about vacancy, but No, these are crises that have more to do with the trenches of cardboard coffins outside of New York City, and the nurses and medical staff who are and the carriers who are transporting the dead in piles. That's what these paintings are about.
Well, I think it's absolutely true that because our movements are so restrictive, so much of our experience has had to have been visual, and
Mhm.
those images are certainly among the very most powerful ones. Nick, I wonder if we could turn to you. You work on many things, but Beethoven certainly central among them. And I suppose if there were ever a composer uh, whose work was associated with crisis, it would probably be Beethoven. The image that we so often see of Beethoven is that of someone frozen in a crisis, it seems. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about Beethoven and the various crises that he had to deal with: personal, medical, physical, uh, medical and physical, I mean,
Yeah, I
uh,
mean, I think that,
political, but also someone who could find his way to the heights of joy and hope, as the choral symphony shows.
yeah, I mean, I think, what the beautiful presentation that Darcy just gave and all the fascinating things that Mark just said remind me, something that I think we all know, but we could use reminding ourselves anyway, which is that, of course, the very concept of crisis is largely a medical one in origin. And that whenever we talk about crisis in the political sphere, we're always talking about the crisis not just of the body, but of the body politic. Something that seems absolutely present to me in that wonderful and troubling painting of Napoleon touching the plague victim. This is the body and the body politic becoming one, and crisis being reached or indeed averted in both. And actually, a lot of the art from that period, including Beethoven, is crisis art, in part because crisis is a buzzword of the period. It becomes a fashionable term in the 18th century and early 19th century as a political diagnosis or prognosis. Rousseau was very fond of the word crisis. We might all recall that Thomas Paine's journal, of course, was called The Crisis. And Burke, and then all of the Viennese Burkeans that Beethoven knew, like Friedrich von Gens, frequently diagnosed the political upheavals of their own period in terms of crisis. So there's a sense in which Beethoven, as a crisis composer, is in part a sort of beneficiary of the crisis as a kind of new political concept, and perhaps even a kind of media idea, something that precisely lends itself to being thematized in a particular way. And in fact, an entire generation of romantics, I mean, Mark, of course, reminded us of Wordsworth, who has a special line in Birth to Beethoven, of course. But also, one can think of all of those romantic writers whom we don't remember, precisely because the crisis wiped them out. They were victims of the crisis, whether it involved being victims of violence, just Priestley, for example, or whether they simply were censored out of the kind of art making practices or writing or painting or composition that they were doing until these these convenient crises descended on them. Now, I think what you see in Beethoven's music and the music of his contemporaries, what you see during this Napoleonic period of crisis is music being mobilized to do a number of things that music's very good at, which is extending time, allowing people to acknowledge moments that may be fleeting when experienced somehow repeatedly, to maybe even luxuriate or commiserate in particular moments. And that these, as Darcy's show also pointed out, these have a powerful propagandistic purpose. I can share with you the kind of Napoleonic items of popular culture that Beethoven would have known and that were known by his contemporaries. This a really good example of a frontispiece of the kind of popular souvenir type piano music, usually with highly elaborate and attractive, as you can see, frontispieces, whose entire function was to take these large commemorative events, perhaps ones that whose visual language are rooted in quite old traditions of kind of Baroque spectacle, as you can see, but in a sense diminish them down to a level not only that can be consumed as a commodity, but then can be taken home and placed on the music stand, almost miniaturized, these moments that one experiences and commemorates, thus in a sense personalized. And it requires an entire media culture for these crisis works to be uh, suddenly made available in this new way. Here's another example: this announcing the return of Kaiser Franz in 1814 after uh, his victory in Paris. Um, this and a good example of what the music looks like, you know, uh, blow by blow descriptions of what's happening in the streets. It says, at the top here, Triumphgesänge und kriegerische Lieder schallen durch die Straßen. These war songs and triumphal songs that echo through the streets of Vienna. So, Beethoven and other musical contemporaries are actually drawing on this new avalanche of popular culture, whose function is not only to sort of process crisis, to perhaps monumentalize crisis, sometimes to make crisis small and consumable in the on the family piano or in the parlor, but in a sense to sort of characterize what great historic moments even are in music, and to be able to draw on the kinds of things that music is very good at doing in order to do that, which is, making time itself elastic, both momentary and also moments that can last for several minutes. I think we're all experiencing now kind of tension that I think is visible in these kind of early 19th century items of popular, call them crisis art, I suppose, which is that on the one hand, art seems to be a sort of activism, a kind of action. It seems to be doing something politically. But on the other hand, it's clearly a sort of proxy for action, or it stands in for it. It's perhaps even, and this is even more heightened, I think, in the case of someone like Beethoven, it's kind of a form of escapism. Both Darcy and Mark have pointed out the sort of inequalities and forms of unevenness that this crisis has both exaggerated, but also, these inequalities that seemed latent before that are now newly visible to us. And I think, one feature of this crisis is that, there's a group of people, perhaps intellectuals, artists, who, perhaps more than any other crisis before, although it's quite similar to the Napoleonic ones, I think, in this respect, are able to talk about the crisis as it's happening. Indeed, there's a sense in which, because a particular media form, in our case, digital interfaces and the sort of cluster of technologies that we characterize as the internet, have had to stand in as a proxy for so much of our sociality and institutional and professional lives. So it sort of produced this avalanche of talk about a crisis from a particular group of people as the crisis is unfolding. And I suppose that makes me, and I think it makes all of us, somewhat uncomfortable, in as much as that, art making and talking about art in this context is somehow always already implicated in a particular set of inequalities or particular set of tensions. And it sort of makes me think of Carl Schmitt's famous diagnosis of what he regarded as the problem of the Romantic period, and indeed his own crisis period of the 1920s, which is the tendency he described as political romanticism. The idea, to sort of pass his theory, that art might feel in some sense glad to have a crisis as a pretext, that indeed big intellectuals and big artists might in some horrible, morally questionable inversion, welcome a crisis because it gives them a theme sufficiently grandiose for what he called their genial apprehensions, And I certainly think there's a kind of a cringe, if one thinks of recent crises, the lag, which is getting smaller and smaller between terrible things happening and art being produced about it, whether that's, comic musicals about topical current events that were so popular, or things being thematized in short films that we can watch immediately on Netflix. And I of course always think of someone like Christopher Hitchens' reaction to 9/11. The sort of almost glee that finally history had furnished this big intellectual with a theme, grand enough for his apprehension. There is, I think, that tension there in Beethoven's music, one between art as a tool of activism and propaganda, art as something that helps us to understand what crises are, and art that, in some sense, draws its justification from big historical events, that maybe even functions as an escape from these historical events by processing them into the kind of forms that we can maybe even, enjoy. And certainly for those of us who are rediscovering the power of Netflix or of musics that we liked before that we can return to again as forms of comfort, maybe even large cultural teddy bears, this crisis could be proving the true power of escapism.
So, Nick, there's a very natural and very correct tendency to think of a crisis as a big public, political, historical event. Certainly, what we're living through is a global event. But when I think of Beethoven and other artists and composers, I also think of personal crises.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you could speak to the question of Beethoven's personal crises and how those factor in his music in relation to the public and political crises.
Yeah, of course, the crisis that we all immediately think of in Beethoven's case is deafness, and that's something that he, wrote about. We actually have the surviving Heiligenstadt Testament from 1802 that describes his response to this encroaching and worsening personal crisis. And it's also clear that, in order to write the extremely eloquent sort of romantic response to his, what he characterizes as an affliction, he drew on the kinds of crisis literatures that he knew. That the language of the Heiligenstadt Testament is very like the language that one reads in, popular sentimental novels like The Sorrows of Young Werther, and that, that for him the crisis as a personal crisis is also one that one needs, in some sense, a language or a media form in order to articulate effectively. Then, of course, his, we can talk about a particular piece of music here, I think. His experience of civic crises in Vienna was pretty extensive. This is someone who lived through 2 occupations and had, direct experience of lockdown. And indeed, the first occupation of Vienna in 1805, right at the end of 1805, was very unhappily coincident with the premiere of Fidelio, his first and only opera, and was largely responsible for its total failure because the theatre was packed full of French troops and not really very many other people. And this despite the fact that the opera itself was, as an explicit form of kind of both public and, in some sense, highly intimate crisis art as he ever produced, based on Jean-Nicolas Bouilly's story of Leonora, so this story of a rescue story, one of these classic revolutionary era stories, sort of guilty stories of the rescue of aristocrats from prisons, often by loyal wives or faithful retainers. It was a transmutation of this kind of French revolutionary aesthetic into the terms of a kind of contemporary German opera. And one thing that we can say about Fidelio, and this is true of a lot of Beethoven's perhaps most famous music, and one that we associate with, his personal struggles as well as the larger geopolitical ones, is that it, really depicts a very right-angled view, kind of before and after view of history, a kind of not only moments of extreme triumph at the end that we associate with Beethoven, but the emergence of those moments from these crisis points that are depicted in music. And it's pretty interesting to me, that it was the crisis points in Fidelio that contemporaries focused on. I can find for you a picture from the first Theater Almanac account of Fidelio, and here we have Leonora stepping in, just as the evil Pizarro is about to kill her husband, shouting "Zurück," back, step back. It's precisely these moments of crisis that become, centrally important to a Beethovenian aesthetic. You can, hear them in works of music such as the overtures. There were several of them that Beethoven tried out to this very opera. The famous overture Leonora Number 3, which turned out to be much too long and symphonic, really, to work very well with the opera, but is still often performed in the middle of the second act, contains within it the moment of crisis. And this, in a sense, we think of as definitively Beethovenian. It's the moment when everything goes wrong, but suddenly we hear the offstage trumpet signal as the good prince intervenes to rescue everyone in their darkest hour. There's a sense in which these moments have become definitively Beethovenian. The crisis point reached and then averted, and of course we can think of equivalent moments perhaps in even more famous works such as the Ninth Symphony or the Fifth Symphony. The famous emergence of a kind of triumphal C major from this dark C minor. And it's, I guess, these things that have made this music so amenable to a series of appropriations right the way through the 19th century. We like to think that these these works, but Fidelio is a really good example, were drawn on at these moments of crisis precisely because they supply a certain logic to events that otherwise seem to elude them. And certainly it's true that in Fidelio's case, it itself was revived in 1814, where suddenly it seemed to be about the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And then in the 20th century, it was the first opera performed in 1945 in Berlin after the Second World War, in 1955 at the Staatsoper in Vienna after the Second World War, and famously right before the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 in the Semperoper in Dresden. Now, again, one perhaps could be a little skeptical here and think about the ways in which perhaps we would like art to step in and have something to say, particularly by an important figure such as Beethoven at these moments. But on the other hand, it's clear that it affords a certain kind of narrative logic in crisis points that seem to stand in need of them.
Well, I think these examples, these Beethoven examples, are so illustrative because he combines the crisis and the joyous breakthrough moment, the glorious resolution. And in fact, if we don't have a sense of what that hope is like, we really don't understand what a crisis is. And we don't really understand the hope unless we know what a crisis is, and vice versa. They really have to be understood together. And I think that's a really important point to keep in mind as we're all struggling and working our way through this crisis with a very, very uncertain and unknown end. It would be very nice if we could believe, if it were true, that all of a sudden there will be a breakthrough and we will return gloriously to the way things were, maybe with some things being better. But more and more, it seems we're discovering that that will not, in fact, be the case. And that's why I think it's also so important for us to keep these historical examples in mind, the kinds you brought to us from Beethoven, the kinds that Darcy has brought to us from Géricault and others, and the kinds that Mark has brought to us in reminding us of Defoe and Kundera and the wars that he's covered. We are just about out of time, which means that we will have to schedule an encore so that we can properly address questions from the Facebook Live audience and others. But before signing off, I do want to thank all three of you for your remarkable contributions and a very stimulating set of ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.